this is very unlikely to have been, very unlikely to have Israeli fingerprints on it. And I think it does mean that now Iran's bandwidth is going to be taken up with working out who was behind that attack.
Let's start, though, with the conflicts in the Middle East. The US has said this evening that it fears heightening tensions after 2 bomb explosions in Iran killed at least 103 people. They were gathering near the tomb of a former Iranian general, Qassem Soleimani, in Kerman on the 4th anniversary of his assassination by the United States. Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, spoke earlier. This has an interpreter over it, I believe. Here he is addressing a press conference earlier today.
In every battlefield, we remember Haj Qassem Soleimani, his image, his name, his soul, his pride, his enthusiasm, and his ever stronger presence. The martyrs who fell today in Kerman remind me of what Imam Khamenei once said. He said, it seems that martyr Qassem Soleimani scares the colonial forces and the Zionists a lot more than Qassem Soleimani when he was alive.
The attack today follows the assassination yesterday of the Hamas deputy leader in an Israeli drone strike in Beirut in Lebanon. So I think it's fair to say that tensions are escalating. Manveen, I suppose the kind of next question is, what is the next stage of this? How far will this escalate to? Does Iran have the appetite to enter into a war with the West?
It's a really good question. It's the one everyone's asking at the moment. I have to say, yesterday, when we heard about the assassination in one of the suburbs of Beirut, which is an absolute stronghold for Hezbollah, to have an attack there is almost the same as sort of attacking Iran. It's little Iran within Lebanon. There was a moment where we sort of thought, could this now blow up into a proper regional conflict? Will this now be a war on 2 fronts for Israel, which some Israelis seem to welcome? I actually think today's events, the explosions in Iran are almost likely, the atmosphere in the Middle East is incredibly febrile at the moment. But if anything, I think they're more likely to put off a regional conflict because suddenly Iran won't really have the bandwidth. They're going to be very busy trying to work out who was behind the attacks today. Obviously everybody immediately thought, is it Israel? But it's not at all. These are not the hallmarks of an Israeli attack. The attacks, there were 2 bombs. They were sort of run by a remote control, which is sort of reminiscent of one of the last attacks that Israel carried out on Iranian soil, which was the assassination of an Iranian nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, back in 2020, where they used this remarkable remote-controlled sort of AI robotic shooting machine in order to carry out this assassination in Iran without anybody having to be on the ground using sort of help from Iranians in order to carry it out. But they've always, that attack in a way is a perfect example of what Israel does when it goes after people on Iranian soil, which is a precision attack where it's going after a specific target. They try not to take out civilians because they know that's much more likely to lead to an escalation, and Israel does not want a war. So this is very unlikely to have been very unlikely to have Israeli fingerprints on it. And I think it does mean that now Iran's bandwidth is going to be taken up with working out who was behind that attack and going after them at a time where, their proxies like Hezbollah are obviously very worried about Israel, as the Iranians are too. So in a way, it almost sort of makes it less likely that there will be a war between Iran and Israel anytime soon.
Yeah, really
I think that would have been put off anyway, but I think this, in a way, this now means it's even less likely.
Yeah, Hezbollah's leader today blaming Israel for those attacks, the 2 bomb explosions at the grave. But your perspective on that is very wise, Manveen, I think. There's obviously lots of inflammatory gesturing going on by the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, today. We spoke to John Bolton earlier, former US National Security Advisor, former US Ambassador to the UN. He says that the war is already upon us.
When people talk about the war expanding, the war already exists on all of the fronts that I just mentioned. The level of intensity may go up, but the conflict has already begun.
That is John Bolton speaking to me earlier. And I mean, obviously, I've had to point out that the West has not indicated they are at war with Iran at all, but he feels that a war, the war, as he termed it, was already happening. Albie, your perspective on this is war already upon us?
Well, I think my perspective is that there's a lot of instability in the Middle East at the moment, and it seems that we've gone from what seemed to be a pretty stable situation pre-October the 7th of last year to a situation where in just 3 months we now have a war between Israel and Hamas. We've had a huge terrorist attack in Iran. We have all the trouble in the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and then them attacking commercial ships in that region. And then also the issues with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And it all just seems to have happened in the last 3 months of 2023. And it just makes you wonder what is going to happen in 2024. Now, I'm not as learned as Manveen is on this issue, but certainly as someone who just looks at this from a perspective as being a news commentator, lots happened in the final quarter of 2023, which was not predicted would happen when we were talking about things earlier on last year. So we just don't know what's going to happen further on in the year. I hope Manveen is right when she says this makes it less likely that Iran will want to get further involved in any conflicts, but we just don't know what's going to happen.
And I should just sort of add, to be fair to John Bolton, and I don't always say that, but to be fair to John Bolton, I think he'd be right in saying we are already engaged in a battle with some of Iran's proxies. So, as Albie was just pointing out, in the Red Sea, we do have Houthi rebels sort of carrying out actions against commercial ships. And we now know that, America and the UK have issued warnings. They are getting involved with that. And they are proxies of Iran. But Iran has always used this sort of method of hiding behind proxies, letting them do the fighting because they can't afford a full-scale war with the West. So they find other ways of waging a war through assassination sometimes, through or that they could try and influence oil prices. There are various ways in which they can try and attack the West or the West's interests.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And they will continue to do that, I suspect. But I don't think it'll be a full-scale war with them.
There was that joint statement this evening, 12 Western governments, the UK and the US included, Germany, Italy, Japan, Australia in there as well, calling for an immediate end to attacks on container ships by Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. They called them illegal, unacceptable and illegal. And it did depict perfectly, I suppose, the West's way of trying to engage through strong statements and the approach taken by Iran operating through proxies within this conflict. We won't deliberately attack back. Yes, we've been defending, and that there has been an escalation in the Red Sea, but not to the point where you'd ever sort of call it hugely dramatic. And the West's approach is to, issue another statement about it. And I suppose it depends how long we can keep issuing statements for, Albie, knowing that they're going to fall on deaf ears, are they, basically?
But ultimately, the West does not want to enter into a war with Middle Eastern powers at the moment. I don't think war is something which anyone goes into lightly, and I'd be surprised if there was a full-scale hot war between Western powers and countries in the Middle East. What does make the situation a little bit more difficult, though, is, of course, the amount of trade that goes through the Red Sea and the amount of trade that goes through the Suez Canal, which is vital for European prosperity. I think it's about 12% of all the goods traded in the world pass through the Suez Canal every year, which is why you are hearing all of these Western powers that you noted earlier on issuing these statements, because actually the trade which passes through this part of the world is essential to the prosperity of this part of the world, and the route around the Horn of Africa is just so much longer, and that makes goods more expensive, and that adds to the cost of living pressures that we're facing in the UK and across Europe.